Sometime around 1654, a man who had already changed the history of mathematics, physics, and philosophy sat alone in a room in Paris and arrived at the most uncomfortable idea he had ever encountered. He had been, until that point, a celebrated genius. He had invented the first mechanical calculator at 19. He had proven the existence of the vacuum when the leading scientists of Europe said it was impossible. He had corresponded with Descartes. He had been the kind of person that other brilliant people traveled to meet. And sitting alone in that room, in the quiet that his brilliance had not managed to fill, he wrote a single sentence that has been disturbing people ever since. He wrote it in French. It translates roughly like this: all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Not some of humanity's problems, not the problems of the idle or the shallow or the undisciplined, all of them. Every war, every bad decision, every ruined relationship, every life spent chasing the wrong thing, traced back in the end to this: the inability to be still. He called it divertissement, diversion, and he spent the last years of his short life trying to understand why we are so terrified of the silence that is always waiting for us. There is something that most people in midlife recognize the moment it is named, but almost never name themselves: the compulsion to fill. Not just the silence, everything. The commute that cannot be survived without a podcast. The dinner that requires the television. The walk that needs the earbuds. The Sunday afternoon that must be scheduled, structured, occupied, because an unoccupied Sunday afternoon produces in the chest something that feels almost like dread. We call it staying connected. We call it staying informed. We call it being productive, being present, being engaged with the world. We have built an entire civilization's worth of technology, extraordinarily sophisticated, genuinely impressive technology, whose primary function is to ensure that we never, ever have to sit with ourselves. And somewhere underneath all the filling, underneath the noise and the motion and the very convincing busyness, something is waiting. Something that the filling is designed, whether we know it or not, to avoid. Something that arrives unbidden in the 3-second pause between putting down the phone and picking it back up. In the gap between the end of one conversation and the beginning of the next.
Pascal knew what it was. He had sat with it himself. And what he discovered in the 17th century, without a smartphone, without social media, with nothing more sophisticated than a quill and a candle and the vast, terrifying quiet of a Parisian room at night, was that the silence is not empty. It is full. Full of everything we have been running from. Blaise Pascal was born in 1623 in Clermont-Ferrand, in the Auvergne region of France. His mother died when he was 3. His father, Etienne, himself a mathematician and a tax commissioner, recognized the child's extraordinary mind early and decided to educate him personally at home with a curriculum of his own design. Etienne made one curious decision. He would not teach the boy mathematics until he was 15, convinced that introducing it too early would overwhelm the other subjects. He hid the geometry books. He forbade the topic entirely. Blaise, at 12, taught himself Euclidean geometry from scratch, alone, in secret, using charcoal on the floor. Working from first principles, he independently derived 32 of Euclid's propositions before his father discovered what he was doing and wept. By 16, he had written a mathematical treatise on conic sections that Descartes, who read it and refused to believe a teenager had written it, described as the work of one of the finest mathematical minds in Europe. At 19, watching his father spend exhausting hours manually calculating tax assessments, Pascal invented the Pascaline, the world's first mechanical calculator. He built over 50 prototypes. The machine worked, it was real, it was revolutionary, and it did not make him happy. This is the pattern that runs through Pascal's life like a thread. Achievement, recognition, the arrival at the thing that was supposed to satisfy, and then, in the quiet after the arrival, the same restlessness, the same unnamed hunger, the same inexplicable sense that something was still missing. He threw himself into science, then into the salons of Paris, the glittering social world of mid-17th century France, the dinner parties and the debates, and the company of the most interesting minds of the age. He was brilliant in those rooms, celebrated, sought after, and still, in the carriage ride home, the quiet came back, the hunger came back, the thing the evening had not managed to fill. Then, in November of 1654, something happened that Pascal spent the rest of his life trying to describe.
The accounts vary. What is certain is this. On the night of November 23rd, between approximately 10:30 and half past midnight, Pascal had an experience so overwhelming that he immediately wrote it down, not in his usual precise philosophical prose, but in a kind of ecstatic shorthand on a piece of parchment, which he then sewed into the lining of his coat and wore against his body for the remaining 8 years of his life. The document is called the Memorial. It begins with a single word written in capitals: fire. What followed was a description of an encounter, not with a doctrine, not with an argument, not with a theological position, but with a presence, a certainty, a quality of aliveness so complete and so different from everything he had chased in the salons and the laboratories that he could find no other word for it than fire. He described it as joy, not the satisfaction of achievement, not the pleasure of a good evening. Joy. The specific, unconditional, completely sourceless joy that does not depend on anything going right. He turned away from the salons after that, turned toward a community of Catholic reformers called the Jansenists at Port Royal, began writing the book that would become, after his death, the Pensées, the Thoughts, the most honest, most rigorous, most unsettling account of the human condition that the 17th century produced. He died in 1662. He was 39 years old. He had been in more or less constant physical pain for most of his adult life, headaches, digestive illness, what modern physicians suspect may have been a neurological condition. He died having completed almost nothing he intended to complete. The Pensées are fragments, notes toward a book that was never written. And yet, what those fragments contain about silence, about distraction, about the specific terror that stillness produces in the human animal, is as precise and as urgent today as it was in 1662. The Divertissement argument, the argument about diversion, is Pascal's most famous philosophical contribution outside of mathematics, and it is worth sitting with slowly because it is more radical than it first appears. Pascal's claim is not that distraction is a bad habit, not that we should put down our phones and be more present. His claim is structural. He argues that the pursuit of diversion is not a failure of discipline. It is a rational response to a genuine problem. The problem of what we find when the diversion stops. He writes, and I am paraphrasing from the Pensées,
that when a man is given everything he has asked for and then left alone in a room with no occupation, no company, no entertainment, he will become miserable, not because he is weak, not because he is ungrateful, but in the silence he comes face to face with himself, with his mortality, with the contingency of everything he has built, with the questions that the busyness was keeping at bay.
The king on his throne needs the hunt, Pascal says. Not because the hunt is more comfortable than the throne, because the hunt keeps him from sitting still and thinking about what it means to be a king who will die. The gambler is not really there for the money. He is there for the absorption, the specific, total, wonderfully consuming state of being, completely occupied with something that leaves no room for the questions. And here is the part that cuts deepest. Pascal does not condemn the gambler. He does not condemn the hunter, or the man who fills his evenings with society, or the person who has turned busyness into an identity. He says, I understand. I have been that person, because what waits in the silence is real. The misery is real. The mortality is real. The questions are real. The diversion is a completely understandable response to a completely genuine problem. But here is what he also says. The diversion does not solve the problem. It postpones it every time, without exception. The hunt ends, the game ends, the party ends, the episode ends, the scroll reaches a natural pause, and the room is still there, and what was waiting in it has not gone anywhere. Now the bridge. Because Pascal was a 17th century French Catholic mathematician writing in the specific context of his own theological crisis and his own extraordinary pain, and most of the people watching this video are not any of those things. But here is what translates perfectly across 400 years. The phone, the podcast, the open tab, the group chat, the news cycle that is always somehow worth checking one more time, the specific, modern, extraordinarily well-engineered machinery of diversion that has been built, quite deliberately, by very intelligent people who understand human psychology, to ensure that the room never quite gets quiet. Pascal did not have a smartphone, but he would have recognized immediately what it is for. Not communication, not information, occupation, the filling of the gaps, the prevention of the pause in which the questions arrive. What questions? The ones that most people in midlife are already acquainted with, even if they have become very skilled at not staying with them long enough for them to fully form. Is this the life I intended? Is the thing I have been building worth what it has cost? What do I actually believe? Not what I was taught to believe, not what is socially convenient to believe, but what do I, in the quiet, actually think is true? What am I afraid of? What do I want that I have never said out loud to anyone? These are not comfortable questions. Pascal knew that. He was not asking you to enjoy them. He was asking you to notice that the discomfort of sitting with them is less costly in the end than the lifetime spent making sure they never quite get asked.
There is one more piece of Pascal that belongs here, because the Pensées are not only a diagnosis, they are, in their fragmentary, unfinished, deeply personal way, also a kind of map. Pascal believed that what we find in the silence, when we stop running long enough to actually sit in it, is not only the questions, not only the mortality and the contingency and the accumulated weight of the unlived life. He believed that in the silence, if you stay long enough, something else arrives. He called it by a theological name. You do not have to use that name. But the experience he was pointing at, the fire of the memorial, the joy that does not depend on anything going right, is not unique to Pascal. It is reported across traditions, across centuries, across every culture that has ever produced a contemplative practice. The mystics call it different things, the philosophers call it different things, but what they are all pointing at is the same. That underneath the questions, underneath even the mortality and the fear, there is something that is not afraid, something that was present before the diversion began and will be present when it ends, something that the silence held long enough eventually reveals. Pascal found it in a single night, sewn into his coat, carried against his heart for 8 years. He did not find it in the salons. He did not find it in the mathematics. He did not find it in the company of brilliant people or in the achievement of extraordinary things. He found it in the room, alone, in the fire that the silence finally allowed to arrive. Here is what Pascal asks of you, practically, today. First, take one real inventory of your filling, not with judgment, with the same calm, precise attention that Pascal brought to his mathematics. For one day, just one, notice every time you reach for the phone without a specific reason. Notice the podcast that goes on the moment you get in the car. Notice the television that comes on not because there is something you want to watch, but because the room, without it, is too quiet. You are not doing this to stop the filling. You are doing it to see it, because Pascal's insight begins with the seeing. The diversion only has power when it is invisible, when it feels like preference rather than avoidance. Second, sit in the room for 10 minutes. Not meditation, not a practice, not an achievement. 10 minutes, once, with no input, no phone, no music, no podcast, no television. Just the room, just you, just whatever arrives when the filling stops. It will probably be uncomfortable. Pascal says, good. That discomfort is not a problem to solve. It is information. It is the feeling of the questions that have been waiting beneath the noise, finally getting close enough to the surface to be felt.
Sit with them, not to answer them, to know that they are there, because a question you know you are carrying is less powerful than a question you are spending your life pretending you do not have. Third, find the one question you have been most successfully avoiding. Pascal believed that every person has one, the specific, pointed, deeply personal question that the busyness is primarily organized around not asking. For some people, it is about work, whether the thing they have spent decades building is actually what they would have chosen if they had stopped long enough to choose. For some, it is about relationship. For some, it is about belief. For some, it is simpler and sharper than any of those, the question of whether the person they have become is the person they intended to be. Write it down. Not the answer, the question, the one that the podcast was covering, the one that the scroll was postponing. Write it down, and then, for just one moment, just one breath, let yourself know that you have been carrying it. Fourth, practice what Pascal called repose, rest. Not sleep, not leisure, not vacation. The specific, active, disciplined practice of doing nothing, of allowing the mind to be unoccupied, unfilled, undirected, for long enough that it settles, for long enough that the questions come and are held and do not destroy you, for long enough that what lies underneath the questions, that thing Pascal found in the fire,
has a chance to make itself known. He is not asking for an hour a day. He is asking for the 10 minutes, the walk without the earbuds, the morning coffee that is just the coffee, not the coffee and the news and the email and the 3 things you need to do before 9. The small, repeated, genuinely countercultural practice of allowing the room to be quiet. That is the practice, not to achieve stillness, to stop preventing it. I want to close with the image that I keep returning to when I think about Pascal. Not the genius, not the mathematician, not the author of the Pensées. The man in the coat, walking through Paris, carrying against his heart, sewn into the lining, a piece of parchment with the single word at the top: fire. The record of the one night when the filling stopped and something real arrived, something he had not been able to find in 20 years of achievement and society and the company of brilliant people.
He carried it every day for the remaining 8 years of his life, not as a relic, as a reminder that it was real, that it had happened, that the silence, the very silence he had spent his youth avoiding, had contained all along what he had been looking for everywhere else. He died at 39, in pain, with most of his great work unfinished. But he died having found what was in the room, having stopped running long enough to let the fire arrive. The room is still there. The fire is still there. The silence has not gone anywhere. It has been waiting, with the patience that only silence has, for you to stop filling it long enough to find out what it contains. Here is the question Blaise Pascal leaves us with today. Not from the salons of Paris, not from the laboratories, from the room. From the 39-year-old in pain who had achieved everything a brilliant man could achieve and still could not explain the hunger, until the night he stopped trying to fill it. What are you filling right now? In this moment, after this video ends, in the 10 seconds before the next thing begins, what will you reach for? And what would happen if, just this once, you reached for nothing? If you let the room be quiet long enough to hear what it has been trying to say, sit with that, just for a moment, not with the expectation of fire, with the willingness to stay in the room long enough to find out if it comes. What question have you been avoiding? Leave it in the comments, because naming it, even there, even briefly, is the beginning of the stillness Pascal spent his life pointing at. I'll see you in the next one.